to start to discuss the politics of Hamas in a normal way, rather than, mustn't talk about it, so scary.
You've spoken about them redoing a charter. It took them 29 years. Mm-hmm. It's a big problem, right?
There has been continuity and discontinuity in the Hamas leadership. Their top-level leaders have been systematically killed.
They look back at the policy of suicide bombings and not participating in the 96 elections. Do you think they have some sort of remorse? Do you think there was maybe a tactical error?
Even the Nazis put high walls around the concentration camps and the extermination camps, which the Israelis who are in Gaza filming themselves on TikTok while committing the most ghastly atrocities. President Trump's representative Adam Boehler he finds that the Hamas leaders in Qatar are people that he can deal with.
It kind of becomes a red herring in a discussion which is about occupation and genocide.
Gosh, that's a huge, huge question.
Speak. And your surname, I pronounce it Cobban?
Yeah, very nicely done.
Okay. No, it's British, so
yeah,
Helena Cobban.
Exactly.
Yes,
yeah,
I'm sure the Americans don't call you this.
The English way is you swallow it,
Yeah, look, I'm South African myself, but I've been around Brits enough to know that you swallow it, yeah. Helena Cobban. Yeah, okay, cool. We good? Okay, great. Hi, and welcome to another episode of Unapologetic. I'm your host, Ashfaaq Carim. Today we're speaking to Helena Cobban. Helena, welcome to the show.
Good to be with you, Ashfaaq.
Awesome, excellent. Helena is a journalist who's covered the Middle East for decades. She's recently just published a book with Rami Khouri called Understanding Hamas, which is why we're speaking to her today. Helena, I've just been telling you over the course of the next hour or so and a bit longer, we're going to be speaking about why you wrote the book, why you chose to do it at this time, the narratives around Hamas, and what you think sort of the future of the Palestinian liberation movement and Hamas and the people of Gaza and the West Bank, what's sort of in store for them. So welcome to the show.
Well, there's a lot to talk about.
It's really a lot to talk about. Just to sort of start us off, why did you write this book?
So I'm the head of a small educational nonprofit in the United States based in Virginia, and we have a wonderful board. Richard Falk is on our board, Rami Khouri is on our board, Nora Barrows-Friedman of Electronic Intifada. We have a very distinguished and wonderful board. In March of last year, we said, there's actually a lot of people working on the question of rehumanizing or humanizing the people of Gaza who have been dehumanized for such a long time. But one thing nobody seems to be taking on is the question of the Islamic resistance movement, Hamas. Nobody seems to want to talk about it. And because we're small and agile, and to be frank, we have very little funding, so nobody's going to sue us, That's why we're agile. We said we want to really take on the issue of Hamas that nobody else wants to talk about. And so we arranged in the first instance to have this series of 5 webinars in May of last year, co-hosted by my wonderful colleague Rami Khouri, who is a Palestinian Christian from Nazareth. I'm sure everybody knows Rami's fine work, and myself. Actually, the title of the project and the title of the book is not just Understanding Hamas, but it's Understanding Hamas and Why That Matters. And the that there refers back to Understanding Hamas, because so many people were just reluctant to talk about it at all. People in the progressive, pro-Palestinian movement, it just felt like there was so much demonization of Hamas that we said we can do this, And so Rami and I invited 5 real specialists. Now, neither Rami nor I is a specialist in the matter of Hamas, but we both have long careers in journalism. We've both interviewed Hamas leaders and activists up and down the chain of command, and we picked out 5 really wonderful specialists. 3 of them are Palestinians and 2 are Europeans. So we ran this webinar series. Actually, when we launched the project and planned the webinar series, I thought maybe, the ceasefire in Gaza would happen pretty soon. So we didn't have a long-term purview for the project, but then it became clear that this genocide was going on and on and on, and people were still very reluctant in the progressive, anti-Zionist movement to talk about Hamas openly. So the next phase was we took the transcripts of the webinars and made them into a book, which was fairly easy, honestly. I have a lot of experience in book editing, book publishing. I pulled the thing together very speedily, and the book came out in September, which, in terms of...
Yeah, absolutely, very quick. I mean, it's also a great way to put together a very sort of interesting, intricate piece of work in a very quick way. So it was a good, smart publishing trick.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, one of the benefits of what we did, having it be the transcripts, is it's very conversational. It's, it just flows along. And we had planned each of those webinar sessions to be sort of pedagogically sound. You start off people assuming that people know nothing, but they're interested in learning.
Absolutely.
And then you take them through and you build progressively on it. So I think it, given that we produced it so speedily, I think it really works.
I mean, you've mentioned the sort of the fact that even people on the progressive sort of Palestinian movement don't want to speak about Hamas or have avoided speaking about Hamas. It's been a challenge for us even as a newsroom. I think the issue is it kind of becomes a red herring in a discussion which is about occupation and genocide. Mm-hmm. So maybe, I think internally, or not just in this newsroom, but among the sort of the people who are trying to unpack what's happening in Palestine, it's almost like we'll get there later. Mm-hmm. And so in a way, congratulations, because I think this gets us there sooner, right, rather than later. But I think the other thing is we're living in a climate now where Hamas is being demonized. You can't have a nuanced discussion. You'll be shut down. If you have credibility on lots of other points, but you sort of want to look at Hamas with any nuance, that will sort of become a red herring again. So it becomes this weird castle. So the next question, I think it's going to take us in the direction of sort of understanding Western policy. But we're now living in an environment where we can get arrested potentially for having this discussion, which is just going to be an academic discussion on trying to understand a very key movement in the Palestinian liberation sort of umbrella body. What do you think that kind of legislation, how problematic is it? The fact that we have counterintelligence, counterterrorism legislation around these things now, specifically around Hamas?
So, I've spent the last 40 years or so, and more than that actually, in the United States, where we have certain protections that are constitutional amendments. They are in our Constitution, including, the First Amendment, which is the right to free speech and freedom of expression and association. We have the Fourth Amendment, which is a protection against undue seizure and search and seizure. And then the Fifth Amendment, which is the right to remain silent. And in general, I think of the American Revolution as a kind of settler extremist revolt against the metropole. But I think these protections in the American Constitution are very valuable, especially when I was preparing to come here last week, because there had already been all this brouhaha about the event that I was doing earlier this week at LSE. And I was concerned that I might get stopped. I'm a British citizen as well as a US citizen, but that doesn't make any difference. Last week, David Miller, who was returning to London from Sayed Hassan Nasrallah's funeral in Lebanon, was stopped and pulled aside at Heathrow. My friend and colleague Asa Winstanley, with whom I have a long working relationship, had his devices seized at 5:30 in the morning a few weeks ago from his home here in the UK. So there is a real concern about these actions. I was quite prepared when I came in at Heathrow to be detained, and I had made arrangements with my family.
Wow.
And a lawyer, and luckily it all proved unnecessary. But who knows when I leave or when I try and go back to the United States. But in the United States, we do have those three very important protections, which are not present here. And that, I know it's scary for all of you. I looked a little bit at the counter-terror legislation and Section 7 and whatever, and you're not supposed to engage in speech that promotes the proscribed terror organizations. I grew up here in the 1950s in the UK at a time of rapid decolonization. and there were the Mau Mau. We were told, be very afraid of the Mau Mau, This whole demonization of national liberation movements is not new to me at all. I mean, the Viet Cong.
Yep.
Or, for French-speaking people, the FLN in Algeria.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, even the ANC of South Africa at one point, yes.
Absolutely. But with a big difference, as we noted a little bit earlier, that the ANC, I think, continuously was able to have a spokesperson here in London. I know somebody who ran the office, even when Maggie Thatcher was, sounding off about the ANC being terrorists and whatever. They still were able to have a voice here, which the Islamic resistance movement, Hamas, is not able to. So I'm going to use my white privilege to say I'm not for Hamas, I'm not against Hamas, but as people who are concerned with ending this goddamn genocide, we have to have it through a negotiation, and that negotiation has to happen including the Islamic resistance movement, Hamas.
A point to be also made is that right now the Trump administration is negotiating with Hamas. So, I mean, there's all sorts of, contradictions within even the policy circles. Just to now get to kind of the meat of the discussion and the name of the book. We're going to have a very detailed discussion about Hamas and who they are. We're going to talk about October 7th. A big part of what we mentioned earlier on when we said people are scared to speak about Hamas. I mean, the big obvious reason is also because of October 7th, right? It's because of the scale of the attack kind of puts someone on the defensive when they're trying to advocate for Palestinians immediately. Unfortunately, and maybe not always, but it doesn't seem to put Israelis on the defensive when you talk about Israel's crimes. But just to begin the conversation in like sort of 3 to 5 minutes, who is Hamas?
Yeah, who are Hamas? Well, goodness, my easy answer would be your viewers should buy the book. But Hamas was is established by the Palestinian branch of the Regional Muslim Brotherhood Organization in December of 1987, at the time of the outbreak of the first Intifada. It was established primarily in Gaza. And one thing I've noticed from my work, both on the PLO and then continuing through this work, is that Gaza has always been the crucible of the Palestinian liberation movement in the modern era, in the post-Nakba era. And, the reason for this is because Gaza is where you have the greatest concentration of refugees from 1948 and their families who are living on Palestinian land. They're not the guests of the Lebanese government, the Jordanian government, the Syrian government, or whoever. So this gives them a rootedness and a sort of a concentration and a focus. So that's why, Yasser Arafat and Abu Iyad and Abu Jihad and all of those back in the day when they founded Fatah, they were in Gaza. And that's where they did it. And Gaza has been playing a similar role in the more recent era. So prior to 1987, the Palestinian branch of the Muslim Brotherhood was one of the branches that was really not focused on politics. They were focused on trying to build the religious community based on observant family life and supporting the life of these families, many of whom, of course, were refugee families, very needy. So it was social services, it was education. And interestingly, all along, Sheikh Ahmed Yassin, the founder of Hamas, prior to that, the head of the Palestinian Muslim Brotherhood, was very focused on women's rights and women's advancement, women's education. He built a lot of mosques in Gaza. It's tragic to even think about this right now, honestly. But he always built them with two stories. So there was a story for the women to gather and pray, and a story for the men. That's fairly rare. this is just one of the examples that we discussed in the book of the ways in which Hamas is different from ISIS or Al-Qaeda, which is obviously one of the ways in which people in this country try to distract and misrepresent Hamas. Oh, it's just like ISIS. They're head choppers. They oppress women. They're very intolerant of religious minorities. All of that. No, Hamas distinguishes itself from those other more extreme organizations by virtue of they have they're kind of like the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt was, a sort of socially conservative and in many ways politically conservative view of the world, but one that was always very supportive of women's rights. So they entered the political arena in December of 1987 and almost immediately had their leaders arrested, and they were still trying to figure out how to do politics, if you like. The more secular nationalist organizations, Fatah and the PFLP and the DFLP and all of those, the Communist Party was quite strong in Gaza in the 1980s. They knew how to do politics. Hamas was still sort of feeling its way. A lot of the leaders were arrested, and then in 1988 they issued their charter, which has been a sort of millstone, I want to say, from a political point of view, millstone around their neck ever since, because it is, an openly anti-Semitic program. And actually, in one of our conversations that's in the book, we talked with Dr. Azam Tamimi, who is, has really studied all these matters very, very close. He said, and I have no reason to disbelieve him, that the charter that was issued in 1988 was just essentially some random school teacher in the refugee camp, because all the leaders were in jail, but there was a felt need to have a program. This is what we stand for. And so this guy kind of wrote it, and then it became the charter. And they were not able to undertake a systematic kind of organization-wide process to update this until 2017, when they issued a new document which supersedes the 1988 document and is much more of a clear anti-colonial analysis of the nature of the Israeli state, the Zionist project, and very, very strongly differentiates between opposing Zionist colonialism and opposing Jews. Of course, nobody in the West really has studied this change very much, apart from some of these experts whom we were able to consult in our project, who were able to explain the various stages through which the movement went, and the status of this new it's not new, it's like 8-year-old 2017 document. But of course the haters still harp on the 1988 charter and say, this proves that Hamas is anti-Semitic and blah, blah, blah.
You've spoken about women and sort of the framing around women that's in the sort of the narratives, and also around the charter. And those are two things that are always brought up. If you see Piers Morgan or any discussions, the charter a lot more often, and then there's almost this slur that because they're an Islamist sort of resistance movement or fighters, that they will probably be horrible towards women. If it's not a direct sort of attribution. What are the other misconceptions that the public and key policymakers have around Hamas? And how many of those misconceptions is because of manufacturing of Israeli Hasbara? And how much of it is because of Hamas's own flaws to kind of put out their messaging more effectively? I mean, you've spoken about them redoing a charter. It took them 29 years. Mm-hmm. It's a big problem, right? So where do you think that balance lies?
Gosh, that's a huge, huge question.
Speak.
So I think I'll start with the misconceptions.
Okay.
I mean, the misconception here, this is sort of something between misinformation and disinformation.
Before you continue, clarify for audience, because I know what it is, but just very briefly, what's the difference between misinformation and disinformation?
Yeah, so misinformation is just like, oh, gee, I'm sorry, I thought you lived on that street, but actually you live on this street, you know.
Yes.
Disinformation is when I say, oh, I live on that street.
Because you don't want me to visit you on the other street.
Yeah,
Yes.
so, you know, it's the deliberate spreading of lies. So I actually also started to develop this critique of corporate media in the West, that there is misrepresentation of Hamas or other Palestinian movements, and there is also, I think, disrepresentation. So the misrepresentation would be sort of accidental, you know, you didn't quite understand the facts, but disrepresentation is when you represent the fact in a way that you know is false. So
yes.
Anyway, that's my new analytical development. I thought of that yesterday or the day before.
Great, congratulations. Good to know.
Thanks. So one of the things that obviously gets I want to use the word demonization here as frequently as possible. One of the ways in which Hamas is routinely demonized is through this idea that they are just, you know, violent people motivated by bloodlust or maybe even carnal lust, the desire to engage in mass rapes, although the mass rapes thing, like the beheaded babies, you know, these Hasbara lies have embedded themselves very deep in many layers of the Western political elite. I mean, embedding yourself in Joe Biden's brain perhaps is not too difficult because, you know, his cognitive functioning not so great, but, you know, he was referring to the 40 beheaded babies for months after it had been categorically disproved. But the mass rapes has actually sort of settled in the popular imagination much more deeply, I think, which is a pity, but it has also obviously been debunked, primarily by the fact that the UN Special Rapporteur who went there to investigate these claims said she found no evidence and was, you know, actually prevented from searching for evidence, which I think tells you everything you need to know about the validity of these claims. But so anyway, this portrayal of Hamas as irretrievably violent, of course, that's very continuous with this demonization of any anti-colonial movement that we discussed earlier. You know, the FLN are so violent, you can't possibly deal with them. But on a number of occasions, the political leadership of Hamas has absolutely demonstrated that they call the shots. Maybe call the shots is the wrong... they're in charge. So back in the mid-1990s, after the American settler in Hebron, Baruch Goldstein, opened fire on worshippers in the Ibrahimi Mosque in El Khalil in Hebron, killing 29 and injuring scores of others, the Hamas leadership said, you know, if Israeli extremists can do this against our civilians with impunity, then we're going to show that Israeli civilians should have no impunity either. So then they launched suicide bombings on the buses. I was in Israel. Our contributor, Paula Caridi, I think at the time was living in Jerusalem. She said it was a scary time. And definitely, I went on a couple of short visits. It was a scary time. But then in 1996, when the first Palestinian legislative elections were held, This was under the auspices of Oslo. Of course, Hamas had opposed the Oslo Accords, the whole Oslo process, and had a very strong critique of Oslo, which, as it turns out, was totally valid because Oslo was such a deeply flawed arrangement. But these legislative elections were held in 1996 under flowing from Oslo, under the rules of Oslo. And the Hamas political people said, well, we're not going to participate in the elections, although actually it turns out Ismail Haniyeh had wanted to participate in those elections, but the collective political leadership decided not to, so he didn't. We're not going to participate, but we want to allow them to proceed. So for the period of the elections, we will halt all the suicide bombings and all the actions against civilians inside Israel. And the military complied 100%. That was a great demonstration. We've seen one more recently, with the ceasefire that was signed on January 15th of this year by the political leadership in Qatar with the Israeli occupying forces in Gaza. And I have seen no reports of any violation of that ceasefire from the Palestinian side, and that includes, Hamas's own military of the Al-Qassam brigades, and then all the allies in the resistance coalition, like Palestinian Islamic Jihad and Al-Aqsa brigades and the Popular Front, Abu Ali Mustafa brigades. They've all complied with the ceasefire. Whereas, of course, we can look at what the Israelis have done since January 15th, which is they've killed, I think 200 people. But I think it's important for people in...
Just to correct you, when you said January 15th, you meant 2025, not 2024, because you said 2000 in case, because there was also a small, but that was December 2023. So just you're talking about January 15th,
this
2 months ago.
Recent,
yes.
Thank you for the clarification. Actually, the earlier one was November of 2023, and again, they,
complied.
We had the political leadership signs this ceasefire deal, and the military complies. So to me, this is very important evidence that it's not, that the military are running riot and doing, atrocities and violent things, and we don't see them doing atrocities. There were violations of international humanitarian law that happened on October 7th from the Palestinian side and from the Israeli side in terms of the Hannibal Directive. But the ones that were committed from the Palestinian side, it's totally unclear who committed them and in what context. For example, taking civilians as hostages is a violation. Who took those hostages? We know that some of them were taken by parties other than Hamas. But there's never been an independent, impartial investigation into who was responsible for which atrocities on October 7th. And right now, I don't think there ever will be one, given the extent to it.
It would be impossible to actually conduct that kind of investigation now.
Yeah.
Okay, so what else do you think are the big, just when you think about the general public, that they just don't understand about Hamas? So you've painted this idea that there's this idea that's deeply embedded in sort of the Western psyche that these are violent people who just sort of want destruction and have a bloodlust against Jewish people or Israelis or Zionists. And then you've mentioned that they're very, very organized and disciplined, which does imply that it's actually negative in terms of October 7th, because it implies that they were under instruction to commit the atrocities that were committed. Although I understand that you're making the same point, that it's complicated to understand who exactly committed the atrocities. But coming back to the question, to what extent do you think this is Hasbara, and what extent do you think this is some errors of Hamas? Do you think, for example, going back, because you've obviously interviewed the leadership for a long while, do you think when they now look back in the early 2010s, do they look back at the policy of suicide bombings and not participating in the 96 elections? Do you think they have some sort of remorse? Do you think there was maybe a tactical error? What's your thoughts on that?
Well, those are good questions, and I think they're really hard to answer. That makes them good questions, obviously. But, there has been continuity and discontinuity in the Hamas leadership. Their top-level leaders have been systematically killed. From Sheikh Ahmed Yassin and Abdulaziz Rantisi and Ismail Abu Shanab, and more recently, obviously, Ismail Haniyeh and Yahya Sinwar, and Mohammed Deif, but Mohammed Deif was more at the military level. So I think what they've developed, knowing that they were always subject to these decapitation operations, is a very robust collective leadership. I've actually, one time in 2009, I was able to interview, I think I had set up the interview with Abu Walid Khalid Mishal in Damascus back in the day. And when I went in, there were like 5 or 6 of them sat around, and they defer to each other. It was very, for me, since I've done some interviewing with Fatah's leadership, it was a very stark contrast, because in the Fatah leadership, it's all Abu Ammar back in the day, or I actually haven't done that much interviewing, I have to say, with Abu Mazen, but it was very sort of autocratic, and people would kowtow to him and flatter him endlessly, and then talk behind his back. I mean, it was like very poisonous kind of attitude amongst the leaders there. In the case of the Hamas leaders, when I've seen them, they have acted together in a very collegial way, and I think that's part of that's the strength of the organization, because everything gets discussed, and then when the Secretary General gets killed, the other members of the political Bureau Political Committee, whatever it's called, they all are just about at the same level of understanding of this factor and that factor. So I think it gives them resilience, but maybe it prevents them from being agile. I'm not sure, because agility also comes. Like Abu Ammar jumping onto the Oslo gravy train was just a horrendous mistake for the Palestinian movement. So maybe there's something to be said for being more collegial and moving more slowly.
I'm a South African, and the ANC operated in a very similar way till today, with their NEC and the fact that they defer to each other. The one exception is when Nelson Mandela negotiated in prison in secret with the apartheid government. He wasn't Abu Ammar. So right. I think that's the difference. Just for our viewers who don't know, Abu Ammar means Yasser Arafat. I think it's what I've also picked up is that your tajweed for a non-Arabic native is just really good. Your pronunciations of Hamas and these names, Abu Walid, Abu Ammar, it's very impressive. So that's a separate thing. But tell us also about how deeply embedded, and it sounds like a horrible word when you combine it with Israeli Hasbara embedded, but just what a social force Hamas is. When I say this, it's not, and I think you're going to clarify it in the answer, so I don't need to clarify it anymore, but just they're much more than an armed resistance or even a liberation movement. Just tell us a bit about that.
So as I'd mentioned earlier, they grew out of this movement that didn't engage in politics, that was about living the right life and building, strong families and so on. And they kept that. I mean, the social services, the kindergartens, the, support for charity and looking after the poor and supporting educational endeavors at all levels. That's continued. And honestly, any successful resistance movement has to do that, because if you launch just an armed resistance, then the occupying power is going to, come back and hit you very hard. And if you don't have social resilience, then that's the end of it. You cannot succeed as a resistance movement or a national liberation movement. I'll give you an example. One of the books I published was by an amazing woman leader in the Algerian FLN. She was the woman who, if you've seen the movie in the Battle of Algiers, she was the one who put the bomb inside the milk bar. And then she holed up in the Kasbah. She's still alive. She's in Algiers today. She holed up in the Kasbah with I think, a couple of other women and a couple of men who had all been in the military wing. And then the French finally got them. And as the French came into the room, the sort of series of rooms in the Kasbah where they were holed up, her main concern was that she had also been responsible for the women's networks in that part of Algiers. And she had the names of all the women on pieces of paper, so she was desperately trying to burn them with a lighter so that they wouldn't get the names of the women in the women's organization. So, she had that dual role. And I think any successful national liberation or anti-occupation resistance movement has to look at social resilience, which possibly is even more important than military action. I don't know.
I mean, it brings us back to another misconception, because another sort of trope against Hamas is that they've taken billions of Qatar's money and everyone else's money, and money that the Israelis have allowed them to access, and build tunnels, and ignored the people of Gaza and ignored social services. Speak about to that, but also, I mean, Israel's complete destruction of everything in Gaza, the 17 universities that existed, almost all the schools are not schools anymore. I mean, the Palestinians are now still sort of getting together and trying to create schools, but the infrastructure itself has been destroyed. Give us a sense of just how developed Gaza was in terms of its educational capacity, high literacy rates, high professional rates, high PhD rates. Just give us a sense of that to get an understanding of just what has been destroyed in Gaza, but also what Hamas's contribution, it's not just their contribution, but what their contribution to that was.
Oh, goodness, this is such a painful subject to me, because my friend Dr. Rifat Al-Arir got killed in December of 2023. I published his first book, the book that he loved the most, and I published his second book. And he was not the only intellectual leader in Gaza, obviously far from the only intellectual leader. He taught English at the Islamic University of Gaza, and the head of the university, Dr. I forget his name, Tufan.
I remember that.
Yeah. Anyway, was killed in a targeted assassination. We're not just talking about accidental bombing. We're talking about targeted assassination of an intellectual leader. And Rifat, in one of his last interviews with the Electronic Intifada, said, if they come after me in person, the only thing I have that I can do is I can throw my expo marker at them. And honestly, when Yahya Sinwar was killed by the drone and he threw the stick at them, I mean, it was eerie to me, the resonance between. So Rifat had never been involved in armed struggle at all. There has been this intentional campaign of scholasticide, of destroying the entire educational infrastructure, along with the water infrastructure, everything that made Gaza into a semi-functioning society in which young people were able to develop their skills in a remarkable way, and what a loss to humankind to have lost those universities, those hospitals, that medical expertise, those teachers, those writers, those gorgeous children. But anyway, I'm not going to become emotional because we can't afford to become emotional. I forget the rest of your question.
No, it's fine. I think you've dealt with that. I mean, I'm gonna not try to make you more emotional, but I'm gonna get more personal, just so that our audience can understand your own expertise and how much you're grounded within the study of this and how much you've covered it before we move on when we start speaking about Fatah in a bit more depth and we start speaking about the West Bank and what's potentially what is in store in the future. You've obviously got a lot of proximity to the conflict. You've covered it for a long time. You've spoken to leaders on both sides, all sides, including Israelis. What has been sort of the toll of that, both personally and professionally? Just give us a sense of, give us also, just like before you even get there, just what you have been doing. Like, when did you start? What got you interested in this? Have you spent time? How much time you've spent there? How long you've been covered this? Just give us briefly, just a good sense of that. And then, well, what's the toll of that being professionally and personally?
Gosh, you do ask small questions, don't you? Okay, so I went to Beirut in July of 1974 to become a foreign correspondent because, it's a kind of white privilege-y type of thing that, Evelyn Waugh did it, a lot of famous writers did it. And I didn't have any female role models. This had always been a male thing. And then about 9 months after I went there, the Civil War broke out. And it was tremendous for my career, because I was there. I was somewhat fluent in Arabic by then. And actually the first serious job I got with a Western media outlet. I got hired by Reuters to be an Arabic-English translator.
This explains the tajweed and your fantastic pronunciation. So, yeah.
Well, actually, it was a complete fluke. I mean, my Arabic was pretty crappy at the time. But anyway, my wonderful colleagues in the Reuters newsroom would help me, the native Arabic speakers. And it was a good experience. And then I also got hired by the Christian Science Monitor, which was a very famous and serious newspaper, daily newspaper that covered foreign affairs, that was always distinguished by the fact, until 2007, that they didn't take advertising. They were run by this somewhat niche church of Christian Science there in Boston. And they didn't need advertising, which distinguished them on everything to do with the Middle East, because they didn't have advertisers breathing down their neck and threatening boycotts if they allowed, a writer to say something that was critical of Israel. And so I had a very good relationship with them, including I did a regular column on global affairs for them until 2007, when they were forced, I guess, by economics to start taking advertising. And then it was, whoops, bye-bye, Helena. So, then I had to reinvent myself. That's a bit of a byline. Anyway, bit of a byway. So, yeah, I was also working for the London Sunday Times. And actually, there's a great story in the Sunday Times magazine last Saturday about that era when I was in Beirut, when our correspondent David Holden was killed. And there's going to be a book come out about that in which I am quoted. But the nice thing was that the Christian Science Monitor would take a story every day if things were moving fast, but they didn't have big expense budgets. London Sunday Times could only take at maximum one story per week. But they had wonderful expense budget. So I would travel all around the region, on the Sunday Times expense budget and file stories for the Christian Science Monitor. So it was very, synergistic. Yeah. I had great editors at the Monitor. They always said, Helena, you're not competing with the New York Times to get a scoop. Your job is to tell our readers why this story is important. So that's been my attitude toward the news ever since, really, well schooled by my editors there. You don't want to look at the epiphenomena. You want to understand what's going on that causes those things, to happen. So I did that, and then, as I say, I got sandbagged by motherhood and couldn't continue to be a foreign correspondent. So I came here briefly, and then I went to the States to write my first book, which was basically just mining my own notebooks of the interviews I'd done, and then going back to some of those interview subjects who were leaders of Fatah mainly, but also the Democratic Front and the Popular Front, and trying to pin together how these constituent factions of the PLO had actually, been born, and what their history was, and what their relationship with the Arab states was, what the relationship between the outside, because by the time I encountered them, they were in Beirut. Prior to that, their leaders had been in Jordan until Black September of 1970. And prior to that, there was a small period when Yasser Arafat and some of the Fatah fighters had been in the West Bank, but they weren't able to do much there. So they were essentially outside the homeland, trying to run a national liberation movement. And so what the relationship was between their leadership outside the homeland and then the resistance movement within the homeland. And that's been a factor in many national liberation movements, including the Algerian one. But in this case, a majority of the Palestinian people are forced by Israel to live outside their homeland. So, the political weight of people outside the homeland is pretty large. But the people inside the homeland are the tip of the spear, or however you... Obviously, after the PLO was expelled from Beirut in 1982, I was writing my book. I was sitting there in Cambridge, Massachusetts, trying to write my book, trying to raise my kids as a single parent, because by then my marriage had fallen apart. And the Israelis were bombing the shit out of Beirut. All my friends and colleagues and comrades in Beirut were being shelled. It was a very traumatic time for me. But I was able to, what's the word? Anyway, I transformed my trauma into writing the book.
Channel. You were able to channel
Yeah. And so the book came out I finished the book in 1983, and it came out in 1984. And then I wrote a book about Lebanon doing the same thing, mining my own notebooks. I interviewed everybody. Bashir Gemayel. I remember going in August of 1976 after the Bashir Gemayel's forces and Camille Chamoun's forces had captured Tel Azata refugee camp. And one of the most chilling things I remember about Bashir Gemayel is that, in any war there are atrocities. I mean, I've learned that from work I've done on other issues in sub-Saharan Africa, that atrocities happen in a situation of war, and so if you want to end atrocities, then you end the goddamn war.
Or the reasons for the war.
Yeah. So that happens in any war, but usually military and political leaders are kind of embarrassed about that. And even one thing I note quite frequently is that even the Nazis put high walls around the concentration camps and the extermination camps. They were embarrassed in essence about what they were doing there, which the Israelis who are in Gaza filming themselves on TikTok while committing the most ghastly atrocities, they don't have that sense of shame, and neither did Bashir Gemayel. So after the Tel Azata refugee camp fell, he called a press conference, and most of the press people were in West Beirut. We all got into cars and drove over to the Phalangist headquarters in East Beirut. And I swear to God, what he said was, "I am proud of what you're going to see in Tel Azata." It was spine-chilling. I mean, I still remember many, many details of what I saw. I mean, I was wearing I stupidly was wearing a pair of red sandals. And, I was treading with these red sandals, which I never wore again, in the gore of bodies that had been run over by the caravan of little pickup trucks that the Kataib supporters used to come in and loot the pathetic little belongings of the people in the refugee camp who had been killed and were lying on the road, and then the looters would come in. They had a little permit that they were given to, this allows you to come in and loot, and they would just drive over the bodies. I mean, that was the Kataib. And so they, of course they were natural allies of Ariel Sharon. Anyway.
Okay, sorry, that was, you did go
quite away from what you were asking.
No, I mean, it's all interesting because I think the part of the question was the personal and professional toll it's taken on you, and that was all in there. Given all that you have covered and all that you've seen, in the course of you having these 5 conversations and compiling the book with Rami, what new things did you learn about Hamas?
I think I learned a lot more detail from all of our guest experts about how Hamas is organized at the political level, at the interior political level. I mean, Paula Caridi, who spent a lot of time in Jerusalem interviewing Hamas people and a range of other people, she explained that there are like 4 wings. There's Gaza, there's the West Bank, there's the diaspora, and then there are the prisoners. So the prisoners are one of the 4 wings. The prisoners are really an important political constituency. So, and then how they make decisions amongst these 4 wings. I mean, I found all that really interesting and new. I got something new from all of them. I mean, I've known Moeen Rabbani and Azam Tamimi for a long time, but I'd never had such good interactions with our other 3 experts. So it was a very enriching experience. One thing I want to say about the book, I explained earlier that, like, the way the webinar series was designed, it was designed for people who are not specialists. You assume when people come to the first session that they don't know anything, and you want to find out what they know. And so we ran this little poll and asked people, do you know what Hamas stands? I mean, like, just the name.
Yeah,
and so a person who's a little bit of a specialist may find that introduction a bit like Mickey Mouse.
I didn't. I mean, maybe I'm not a specialist, but I was reading through it last night in preparation for this, and I found it very interesting because I think it's interesting to try to understand how much people understand.
Yeah, so that you can speak to them as effectively as possible. So what we did at the end, we actually included some of the basic documentation. We included considerable excerpts both from the 1998 and from the 2017 charter documents. We included an excerpt from the document that the Hamas leaders put out in January of 2024 about the operation of October 7th, the operation of the
Al-Aqsa flood.
Al-Aqsa flood. And we put in, things that non-specialists might want to know, like the timeline, a little timeline that we put in, and what you call dramatis personae, like who, because of course in the conversations we were referring to this person and that person, but we didn't have time during the conversations to explain, Abdulaziz Rantisi was such and such a person, and we put in a bibliography. So we really do hope that it's going to be a sort of a primer, as we say in America, primer, I guess, here, that can help people in the general public to start to discuss the politics of Hamas in a normal way. rather than, oh, mustn't talk about it, so scary.
You are a journalist and you have covered the region for, well, it seems like 4 decades or longer. So it's a connected question, but both in terms of when you were writing the book about the PLO back in the 80s, and in terms of what you see from media coverage now, and going back to, obviously, when you were given freedom and a big expense budget to go and do what you needed to go get done, there was one outlet. So there was one outlet in the in a plethora of other outlets that maybe weren't as friendly or that interested, or didn't have weren't interested in the motivations of why things were occurring. But when you compare, because it's almost the same sort of climate, whether you're book writing or writing for a newspaper or a media outlet, when you compare sort of the climate now to writing this book or putting this book together, and what you see in the media compared to what you were doing in the 80s, is it similar? Because I mean, maybe it is. Like, I have no idea, because I was very young, as a little baby when you were compiling that book. Or is it remarkably different? Is it much more challenging? How is it challenging? How is it more challenging? What's not more challenging? Just how do you compare sort of the media narrative environment now compared to then?
I'm not active in the media right now. I wish I could be. I wish I had more time to do my own writing, but I've been, administering the publishing company and the nonprofit, and it's too much goddamn administration, to be frank. But my sense is that it's the balance of world power that is very different now, and that opens new opportunities for communication and media to operate at different levels. So, back in the 70s and 80s, when I started my writing career, we were still in the Cold War. So the big kind of Syrian or anti-Egyptian tropes were, they're in the pocket of the Soviets, they're part of the Soviet threat. And of course, the Israelis were kind of fueling that, trying to make themselves into essential allies of the West. And then we had the end of the Cold War and the spread of Clintonism and the rules-based order lorded over by the United States. And that brought its own kind of coloring to the global media environment. But we also had, in that context, the rise of Al Jazeera as a global media presence, which was interesting and challenging, and because nobody had ever seen anything like that before. That was a good presence in the English-speaking world as well as in the Arabic-speaking world. And now we have a very different, again, media environment globally in which, let's face it, the people who are citizens of the white empire constitute about 12% of humankind, which is roughly the same as the percentage of South African citizens in the apartheid era who were white. And just as apartheid was not sustainable within South Africa, it's not sustainable in the global context, especially when you have the rise of China and the BRICS, including South Africa as the S in BRICS, and what some people call the global South, some people call it the global majority, is becoming much more and more of a presence economically and politically, and I would say also in terms of global media. So, and the fact that we now have internet-based media helps that to happen. So I'm pretty excited. I mean, back when the internet was new, my son Tarek said to me, "Oh, Mom, you should start a blog." And I said, "A what?" And, so he explained to me and showed me how I do it. And I started blogging in 2003. It was so exciting to be able to have those conversations across national borders. I mean, I don't know if you remember, but just the blogging around Iraq.
I remember it. Yes, I do.
And the idea that there were people sitting in Iraq able to write and broadcast through the internet their experiences under the American bombs was mind-boggling and so exciting. And so, I think all of that, both, the development of the internet and the growth of the global majority is going to open up a lot more opportunities for all of us to communicate. It's just that here in the heart of the white empire, recognizing that England is one of the like prime developers of settler colonialism, starting in Ireland and moving on from there to large chunks of the Earth's surface. So, I really feel we are sitting here in the heart of the white empire. We got to recognize that what goes on here with, Zionist protests and whatever, it's a tiny portion of what's happening in terms of global history. And people sitting in Malaysia or Southern Africa, like, look at what happens in London or Columbia University, and they can't believe it. Like, how do the Zionists, how dare they try to control what they think of as the global narrative? But this is not the global narrative. What happens in London or New York is no longer the only global narrative. So to me, that's exciting.
I mean, it's a great point. And increasingly, I think people, and I know this because I obviously fraternize with my friends and family in South Africa all the time. I think increasingly these places look like basket cases. and I honestly, it just seems like, what is this world? Like, we go to university and say what we want, and, for good or bad, and clearly be in the centers of the great seats of learning. People are now struggling to do that, and there's no other word besides basket case. Like, it looks and seems extremely immature, extremely silly, and very much like it's not just the economic order is turning, but almost like the civilization and morality order is turning. I mean,
and the hypocrisy. The hypocrisy
it's
over,
a joke.
like,
it's completely ridiculous.
We're for the rules-based order. We oppose the Russian atrocities in Ukraine. But genocide in Gaza, whatever.
Yeah, no, I mean, if anything, it's been insightful to try to, just witnessing the last 16 months, it's been horrible, but it has been insightful in terms of trying to understand what narratives were like in the height of colonialism and slavery, and to see how they were able to own, the white minority, supremacist minority, were able to own language and think that they can then change reality. But it's just the narrative which is eventually going to turn, because you're not changing reality.
And we have to recognize that this genocide that's underway in Gaza, in all its tragedy and its goriness and its just outrageousness, is not the first genocide in history.
Absolutely.
Every time the white empire has like invaded the Caribbean or Australia, they've done exactly this.
Absolutely, and often far, far worse.
But we never heard about it
eradicated
until,
people, yes.
Later you can dig up some details.
Yes, absolutely. Coming back to discussing Hamas and sort of the details of it and what you've learned from it, we've discussed a lot of what the misconceptions are about Hamas, and we've kind of hinted on, maybe strategic failures about them. I mean, what do you see? Are there, and I don't even want to use the word shortcomings, because in some instances there has been atrocities, both from the Second Intifada and now. But in terms of understanding their leadership structures and what they've tried to do, what do you think are their shortcomings?
They're not great at communicating. But look at the obstacles that they face in doing so. I think I really don't want to speak too much about their shortcomings. I think they have shortcomings, evidently, but compared with the things that have been done against them, like the behavior of the PLO leadership has been outrageous. But then, for example, when President Trump's representative Adam Boehler goes, he finds that the Hamas leaders in Qatar are people that he can deal with. He previously was the one who dealt on behalf of the first Trump presidency with the Taliban leaders. So he knows how to deal with people who are different. I'm not saying that Hamas is the same as the Taliban, but he recognizes that when you have to do a negotiation, and the other side, according to what he has been saying, has been putting forward some very interesting proposals. I'm kind of impressed by what he says they've been saying. I'm surprised by some of what he claims they have been saying. Could they have done things better? Should they have predicted the unhinged ferocity of the Israelis' response to October 7th? I don't know. I mean, that is a question that people say, would they have done October 7th if they'd known what the response would be? Nobody will know. Well, maybe some people will survive that can be interviewed later. But obviously, Sinwar and Dave can't be interviewed. There have to be other people in the military planning who we could ask, did you actually think this thing through to the bitter end? But let's face it, the Israeli military collapsed much more speedily than I think almost anybody would have predicted.
You've mentioned compared to things that the PLO have done. Can you give us a sense, as our audience as well, just what Hamas leadership in Gaza has been like over the course of since 2006 with PLO leadership in the West Bank, and what are the key sort of macro differences?
Well, the PLO leadership in the West Bank has been acting, in effect, as subcontractors for the Israeli occupation, including, they set up this whole system of Area A and Area B and Area C. In Area A, this is all deriving from Oslo. In Area A, which is kind of the city centers, town centers, the PA, which the full name of the PA is Palestinian Interim Self-Governing Authority. So it's supposed to have been an interim body that lasted 5 years. It has now lasted, 20, whatever, 30, years, whatever. So in Area A, the PA has allegedly full control. And then there's Area B around that, where they have civil control, but the Israelis have security control. And then there's Area C, where the Israelis have civil and security control, but some Palestinians are allowed to live there, like in Musafir Yatar and these places, that are under constant threat from the settlers. But actually, I was in Ramallah a few times, and the Israeli military enter with impunity with advanced coordination from the PA forces. So the idea that the PA are responsible for security in Area A is pie in the sky. Actually they are acting as subcontractors for the Israelis. So in Gaza, the situation was very different. I have to note that both of these portions of the occupied territories and East Jerusalem, and East Jerusalem is an integral part of the West Bank, although it's been annexed by Israel. Both these are captive markets for the Israelis and therefore have been profit centers for Israeli economic interests since 1967, which is outrageous if you think about it. And every single time that that the Israelis go in and destroy stuff, whether in the West Bank or in Gaza, and then there's a ceasefire, and then the Japanese and the EU pour in a lot of money for reconstruction. All that reconstruction material has to go in through Israel or from Israel. And it's a profit center, for Israel. And the same, I hope the same does not happen in the reconstruction of Gaza that takes place over the coming years, because that would be outrageous. I think the reconstruction of Gaza has to take place on the basis of the end of Israel's occupation of Gaza. And I hope the Arab states see it that way as well, because so long as Gaza remains an economic a captive economy, then they cannot have anything meaningful in terms of national development. But they did have, since 2006, a degree of development that was under the eyes of the Israelis as part of this Israeli colonial policy of divide and rule. So whenever Western nations, from time to time, they would kind of wake up from their slumbers and say, oh, we've got to, give something to the PA, we've got to give them a framework or a horizon for negotiations that may last 500 years, but we got to give them some kind of a diplomatic horizon, then the Israelis would allow more Qatari aid into Gaza to build up the Hamas
counterbalance to Fatah.
Competition to the PA. So they honestly did not want to find themselves administering Gaza. That's quite clear. But Tariq Baqouni wrote this book with the really unsuccessful title of Hamas Contained, which is an excellent book, but the title is because Hamas was not contained. But I think that was the Israeli goal, to use a few little Qatari-funded projects to keep Hamas contained in Gaza and more or less quiescent. Then, obviously, we saw that was not the case.
You've used the term captive market. I've never actually heard the term before. I think it very accurately describes what's going on. Just to clarify, I mean, it's part of the question as well, but the idea there, the inference there was that in reconstruction efforts, the Israelis siphon off some money, not to mention that it's a captive market in the sense that they can plunder and steal and often also sell their goods and establish monopolies so sort of as a clientele. That's what you meant, right? Just
absolutely. It's a term in development economics.
Okay.
Yeah.
You've mentioned the reconstruction of Gaza, almost like it's an inevitability. I know that it may not be an inevitability. You've also mentioned talks that are happening right now with Trump's negotiators and Hamas. At the same time, there's Israel, who in all likelihood does not want to see Gaza reconstructed, does want to ethnically cleanse Gaza. At least that's the notion I get from all of their activity. They are annexing the West Bank. Realistically, when you take all of this into consideration, what do you think is going to happen?
There are so many possible futures. I think the Israelis are overextended. They're trying to carve out chunks of Syria and Lebanon. There are forces inside the Israeli political system that talk about going to the Euphrates. And meantime, the Israeli military, by all the accounts that I read in Haaretz and elsewhere in the Israeli media, are actually fairly reluctant to restart the military operations in Gaza because they've suffered some losses. They've suffered, some hundreds, serious number for Israel of actual deaths, but a lot of mental health issues. In this country, I think the kind of the mental health anguish of pro-Israeli people who say that, I can't talk about demonization of Hamas, I can't talk about solidarity or whatever because it'll trigger their emotions. I tend to discount that, but I think it's true that a lot of Israeli military people and their families who have been in Gaza and been participating in some of these horrible atrocities have suffered mental health consequences because they have been acting in an inhuman way. And I think there is a real reason that the IDF, significant people in the IDF leadership are reluctant to resume the military operation. They have been given, how many thousands of these 2,000-pound bombs? So those you can drop from on high. And they may be dropping them on Iran. They may be threatening to drop them on Iran. But I think the international community is aware of these dangers. I've seen like a lot of good and interesting reports of the Chinese Navy doing exercises in the Arab Gulf, that portion of the Indian Ocean that's up there. And we know that the Chinese have done some remarkable diplomacy, including bringing about a reconciliation between Saudi Arabia and Iran, which they did almost exactly 2 years ago in March of 2023. So we're no longer talking about U.S. power being unchallenged and unchallengeable in the region. The Russians have concluded a very intriguing defense relationship with Iran. And so, the idea that however many 2,000-pound bombs that the Pentagon can give to Israel is going to solve anything, it's not going to solve anything in the modern era. But of course, a lot of people are going to get very badly hurt along the way. Will the people of Gaza be further attacked and bombed and starved? Well, they are being starved right now. They have shown unbelievable resilience, but we can't, as people who support their rights, make any demands that the people of Gaza have to stay resilient. If they, they've demonstrated their resilience, and no, our job, rather than sitting and thinking what they should do, our job is to stop our governments from continuing to arm and support this genocide and the mini Gazas that Israel is doing all over the West Bank right now in front of our very eyes, and the encroachments in Syria and in Lebanon. There is a reason that the United Nations was founded in 1945 on the basis of international law, with the International Court of Justice that is supposed to implement and oversee the implementation of international law. The International Court of Justice has ruled that Israel's entire occupation of the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and of Gaza, is illegal. So now we need to see the powers in the global majority confronting this tiny but vicious white empire and tell the white empire it's time to obey the rules. And of course, in terms of white empire, I include Israel's leadership as part of that.
Final question. I know it's been a long interview, so thanks for bearing with me. If there's one thing that you'd want readers to take from that book, or even viewers of this episode, what is it?
I would want them to support a negotiated ceasefire ASAP, and to see that the Hamas leadership is a body that has to be a part of this negotiation, and that is positioned to be a constructive and productive part of the negotiation. And then to let the Palestinian people, of whom I'm not one, have the best chance at having some kind of a democratic process to build a new national leadership for themselves that would include all the relevant political factions.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Helena Cobban, thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure.